the microphone. I'm speaking. There you are. Good
You
word.
sound like Dr. Zoidberg from Futurama.
From who?
Dr. Zoidberg.
I don't know who that is. That's a pop culture reference I can't relate to.
I'll show you that.
You'll have to.
It's just the opposite guy.
Huh? Any
Yeah,
pop
yeah.
culture references after 1970, I don't get.
Oh, nice. From the 90s.
I still don't get it. I used to be undefeated in Jeopardy, but anything after 1980, I'm done. Just totally done. It's a great story. My uncle, my mom's brother, who was graduated #1 at Stevens Institute of Technology after coming home from World War II, where he was injured in the Battle of the Bulge. Give you an idea. And then a lot of the guys went on the GI Bill, became a mechanical engineer. Brilliant. Brilliant. The consensus, and I'll brag about myself, we were the two smartest guys in the family. The guy was 10 times smarter. The original Jeopardy was filmed in New York with a guy named Art James, long before Alex Trebek and that type of, it was all like cards, the old style Jeopardy, before they went video. He went to audition. He didn't get anything wrong. Like they play mock auditions, they wouldn't take him. Oh, we want to get people from out of the New York metropolitan area. Baloney. I mean, he would have been Ken Jennings. He would have won. They were never defeated. That was like $10, $20, none of this 100, 200, all that type of stuff. It was like that. They wouldn't take. I was like, how could they do it? He goes, they knew he was unbelievable. We used to race. We used to watch Jeopardy in college in the old days and do that. Try to get. Now I couldn't do anything. Music of the 2000s. I give up. All right, on with the show. So I'm feeling, as you can probably tell, a little not great after crawling in the mud. So the knee. That way I don't misspell it. Gnome, knee. Hey, then you never mess up spelling. So we have knees. The knee is the most complex of all the joints. And in a sense, what's unique about it more than the fact that it's got 3 joints, not 2, and one giant joint cavity. So you have a joint between the femur and the patella. That's what we see here anteriorly. It's not, and it's the part of the patella that's here. On the internal side of the patella, it's covered in cartilage. The exterior is a sesamoid bone, and it forms in this case, a tendon or a muscle. So in this case, it's enveloped by the quadriceps tendon and the patellar tendon, which are extensions, as you will learn, of the quadriceps femoris. And that's just one aspect of it. I think it's more about stability and power, because it acts more like a little fulcrum from a mechanical perspective. And so that, though it's by no means the most important joint, if you had to remove a kneecap, which sometimes you have to do with a fracture, it's hard to get these short bones to heal without causing a lot of problems. You could still walk, but you would lose power and you'd lose the ability to completely extend. So it does have a certain amount of motion. What's interesting about it, if you think mechanically, when you bend the knee like this, straightening it, and it's hard to do with these models, but you see that this rides along. So when you're upright, the patella is up here. When it's down, it follows along this fossa. This is an elaborate sort of aspect of the cartilage against cartilage. It's here, and it rides down. So it follows with this, and basically the patella, as you can see, when the knee's flexed, it will be all the way down here, almost in the cavity. And when it's extended, it's up like this. And it's designed to ride centrally, but the moment of force, basically the quadriceps tendon comes in like this from lateral, and then the patellar tendon goes that way. So it's kind of like a bowstring. And if the foot and the leg is not exactly centered, it tends to ride this way. It gets pulled along. You increase the angle. Sometimes not, or a flat foot, and it'll pull it to the side, and it begins to ride irregularly. So it's a very famous diagnosis called chondromalacia, which means softening of the cartilage, patella. And it's one of the most common knee problems. And the secret sauce for helping knees is straight leg raises. That's the magic behind it. So you end up with, if you're doing rehab for a knee, basically have somebody lying on the floor, table, whatever, pull your toes towards your nose, and then do what are called progressive resistance exercises, which means you have a certain number of reps and a certain number of times, but you gradually increase the resistance. That's a strengthening exercise as opposed to a range endurance type exercise. And that's because if you also learn one of those four muscles that make up the quadriceps inserts into the capsule of the knee, and basically effectively you're tightening that muscle and reinforcing the capsule. So already it's interesting in that regard. Then you have two separate other joints between, so the fibula does not apply. Fibula is sort of like a reinforcing strut. And so you have the medial and lateral condyles looking from behind of the femur against the medial and lateral condyles, respectively, of the tibia. But then you can see, because the condyles, as you will see on the tibia and the lat, are relatively flat, you have these two fibrocartilaginous gaskets, famously called the menisci. So now we have a whole variety of things. You have a very interesting capsule that's very strong in the front, not a whole lot in the back. You have probably about 12 different bursal sacs that are typically used. You have an extra joint here, which just plays some role in the power that you generate. You have collateral ligaments, all between long bone to long bone, there's always collateral ligaments. So you have medial collateral and lateral collateral ligament, except the lateral collateral ligament is external to the capsule, we call it extracapsular, where the medial collateral ligament is part of the capsule. So it's effectively within the capsule itself, okay? And not done yet, not even close. So unfortunately, not only is it adherent to the capsule, and I don't demonstrate on these models, it's also adherent to the medial meniscus. And then we really get complicated. You can see it from behind, you'll see it from the front. You have two crisscrossing ligaments, cruciate, crisscross. Anterior and posterior, the anterior being thicker and typically going from lateral to medial and the posterior from medial to lateral. And those ligaments are designed to resist forward and backward pulling and tugging. So you have stability side to side from the collateral ligaments. You have within the capsule, you have intracapsular, capsular, and extracapsular, as well as menisci, additional cartilage. You've got more stuff to go on than you can shake a stick at. And additionally, medial collateral ligament, medial meniscus, and the anterior cruciate ligament are all adherent to some extent. From that, you will see in the illustration, you get something called the triad. Should have a drink along. So the tibiofemoral joints, the menisci are there, hinge, flexion, extension, and because of when you flex the knee inherently, now you permit a certain degree of rotation, which is essential for walking, because it helps to translate the shock. Somebody with a stiff knee has a very, very difficult time walking. So voila, you can see it here. You have, and this is just a few of the bursal sacs. You have one above the patella. You have an additional amount of synovial fluid within here as well. You have a subcutaneous prepatellar bursal sac. You have fat pads. You have a deeper bursal sac. Just a few. The menisci are wider on the outside, narrow on the inside. And so they're concave with wide rims. You can see the illustration, the cruciate ligaments that are there. All sorts of difficulty. When I started as a resident in June of 77, okay, we were just starting to use arthroscopy. Now almost all knee surgeries are done by arthroscopy, unless you're doing a total knee replacement. And it wasn't a flexible scope, it was a rigid scope that you would look into and they could see the damage. And theoretically, you could have like a little snare from the side and go, when you do an arthroscopic surgery, you basically fill the joint with saline to expand it. And then you're looking under direct vision, and then you have a port for the saline, you'll have an exit port, and you'll have a side port that you can use with either a burr or a drill or whatever you want to use. And basically what you do when you fix a meniscal tear very easily, you just smooth off sort of shave off the irregularity in the meniscus and suck out these little fragments. And then the body fills in with scar cartilage. That's why people have many, many of these surgeries. Pursuant to the game last night, they were talking about maybe the best all-time center before the late Mike Webster. Okay, it was a guy named, and Jim Ringo would be in that with the Packers, a guy named Jim Otto, double Otto, because he had two zeros. Now they can have zeros, but he was in the original AFL. And who had at least 9 knee surgeries, has had multiple joints, but he's still alive, about 85 years old. Because of infections and problems with these multiple surgeries, he's lost a leg. Doesn't regret anything. One of the all-time, and they were talking a little bit about him last night during the game. He was in Super Bowl number 2 when the Raiders played the Packers, with some very famous characters are in those games in the original Super Bowl. I've only missed one, and I was on a plane to Vegas. So I lost. It doesn't help. It's okay. So take a look for this. So here you can see going from, if I misstated before, I apologize, from medial to lateral, this is the wider anterior cruciate, and posterior from lateral to medial. But the adherence of this to the medial meniscus, which is a little bit more, this is more circular, this is a little bit slightly different in shape. You can see the wide gasket-like appearance on the exterior that's there, and they don't quite show the ligaments from that. So that's what I was telling you in surgery, we would look at it, and then we'd open up the knee because you do an open procedure. And it was just fascinating. You make a side, basically a horizontal incision, not a vertical incision. Because again, if you remember, those lines of skin tension close a little bit easier. And we look in there and we see these structures. And in the old days, we just sew them back together. We really didn't do a whole lot of advanced techniques in grafting that they do today. The science wasn't as clearly understood. So, I mean, there were so many nuances to this. So I was, and there's, again, this is the better part of 50 years ago. We did one of the early knee replacements at my hospital. Hip replacements were in their infancy, all those types of things. So it was early on with the material science and the technology of joint replacements. Very, very fascinating stuff. And we were a small inner city hospital. I mean, but we had 2 all-star orthopedic surgeons who were in their early days were considered the best in the city of Philadelphia. So and if you go into that field, there's some very famous orthopedic textbooks. Our department chair in orthopedics wrote the chapter on shoulders for this. I'm trying to remember who the name was. Italians. They were both of Italian surnames. So moving on, the joint itself, the capsule is relatively thin, and again, there's not a whole lot in the front. There's just there's so many other bits of tissue that are there, and the fancy name that you're going to see is called retinacula, as you can see it here. And you'll see the illustration a little bit. Retinacula are not quite as dense as ligaments, but fairly strong. And so you remember I was telling you about like a bicep tendon popping out. That basically is held in place by a retinacula, that the trauma of like being pushed that away in a football game will pop it out and it'll go through the retina. So basically you push it back in and overshow the retinacula. Sometimes it'll deepen the groove a little bit. So you can see all the bursal sacs, they're there. So this is what it looks like anterior, and I may have misspoke before that. The capsule is stronger posteriorly. So here you can see this massive muscle called the quadriceps. You only can see 3 of the muscles forming the quadriceps tendon. And recently a couple of athletes, this is the area where it tears. It's called the myotendinous junction. Okay, and that's where we do see most the structural weak point when you hear about a tendon rupturing. Typically it's there, in and around that area. And so you have the vastus is called vastus lateralis, vastus because it's so large. This is vastus medialis. And because this one comes down relatively straight, and we'll look at all those with the muscles, it's called rectus femoris, and the vastus intermedius is underneath that. That's the one that inserts directly into the capsule. You can see the patellis, you have the quadriceps tendon, and then you have additional retinacula alongside the patella, and then the very famous patellar ligament or patellar tendon, And that's the knee jerk one that we're also familiar with. And so trying to show you here, the fibular or lateral collateral ligament is spaced away from the joint where the medial one is not. And that's the point I was trying to make before. So it has all those different ligaments. So side to side stability is collateral ligaments. And in the back, you have another ligament called the oblique. Comes at an angle. You have one that arches, that reinforces. That's where arcuate, you'll see that name. And so this is the popliteal fossa area. Popliteal fossa is that indentation behind your knee, and a lot of stuff goes on. Nerves, blood vessels, very challenging area. Very common area for a cyst, affectionately called by some, I don't know what the derivation, called a Baker's cyst. And it could be somewhat enlarged, looks like a tumor, but they're more common than you think in the back of the knee. We end up working on a lot of those. And there's so much going on here. You have these giant muscles. You have the gastrocnemius, which one on each side, which are the biggest portion of the calf muscle, sort of by their appearance. They're external. You have one underneath it from down here called the soleus. We'll get to that. Now you can begin to see, and there's so many different structures. It's a very, very busy area. And so there's a lot of problems that are associated with that. And here you have the cruciates, okay? And when you're looking at it, and now they do it in the blue tent on the sideline. So you see a lot of knee injuries even now. They were bones that were angled and twisted yesterday. But you'll see them on the sideline. In the old days, you used to have the trainer would get out there and the physician, the guy would be laying down, they'd have his foot up like this, okay, and bend in his knee, and then they stabilize his thigh and they pull forward and backward on the upper tibia. They're trying to, it's called the drawer sign. And so imagine a drawer that's broken. When you pull out the drawer, all of a sudden it's coming right at you. So that, if this tibia would go out much farther than expected, or obviously over time you know what looses and what's not. That's called an anterior drawer sign. That means the anterior cruciate. Backwards, you have the posterior drawer sign. Sometimes you'll have them both. Typically, when we see non-contact injuries, they're it's mostly anterior cruciate, and they're easier to deal with because you don't have a lot of other problems. Those guys, and not just guys, obviously, but those sport individuals, famously Rod Woodson tore that, and he and Dion were the best two cornerbacks, actually. And Rod Woodson, Mel Blount. And so Rod Woodson, non-contact, tore that in like the first or second game of the season and managed to come back. And then there was a losing effort in the Super Bowl against Dallas back in '95. And surprised a lot of people. He later won a Super Bowl, interestingly, with the Raiders. And then he may have even won another one because he went to Baltimore. He went from cornerback to safety because he probably lost a step. World-class hurdler at Purdue. And the Steelers, one of those guys the Steelers moved up in the draft a couple of places to get. Just a fabulous player. So it's all about, that's anterior and posterior stability. So here you can see them pretty well picked here. And I saw this view a lot because when we would do a knee, a lot of times we make a incision this way, curl it around like this, and then down here and almost like flap it over. Then you take a look at that. A lot of cartilage here. These are the femoral condyles. You can see them in this guy that are present. So with all of these, and we would do things like that and then put everything back together. And it was just remarkable how much, let's say, a non-professional or world-class athlete could get back with just basically in the old days just sewing it back together. And they'll just show you some of these illustrations you can scroll through. So the knee injuries, collateral ligaments, cruciate ligaments, cartilages, or menisci, particularly enforced the lateral blows with the knee extended. Okay. Then you get what they call the triad of injuries. Nothing new on the horizon. This was written about in 1958 by one of the early sports medicine orthopedics. His name was O'Donoghue, and I think he was out of either Kansas or K-State or Oklahoma. So what happens is, if it's just the ACL, directional change, that's what I mean by non-contact or twisting. And yeah, they're all surgically oriented. So here they're showing you a relatively straight leg with a forceful injury coming from the outside, and you can see the triad of injuries. tibial collateral ligament, medial meniscus, and the cruciate. So and you can see these. There's so many examples. My middle one was maybe I told you, a BMX bike rider. Okay, so he's doing a backflip on dirt jumping, and put his leg down to stabilize him. He was trying to do a double. I did a single. And he used to ride with some of the with pros, guys who were in the X Games and things like that. Still crazy. And managed to do his, when he was 16, managed to do his ACL. So and what they do is they do a graft. They took a piece of patellar tendon with a little bit of patella and a little bit of tibia, and effectively the graft is a bone graft. Bones heal. So it's easy to absorbable screw into basically into the femur and into the tibia, and now let that little strip of patellar tendon effectively take the place of the ligament. And you can do that with cadaveric. You can do that was an autograft because it came from him. You can do it with cadaveric bone and bone sections, all those things. So he had that done in 2000, 2001. He's the advanced age of 39. So we see a lot of cartilage tears and fragments. And when the cartilage fragments off, it calcifies and it can squeeze into those. Remember, the capsule's like accordion pleated. If it gets into those little pleated areas, it jams it up. And a lot of times that's what will cause a knee to lock up. And I've seen it in elderly people because it's more common. Okay. So typically arthroscopic surgery, and most of the time it's, and I had this done myself, certainly not athletic at all. I would be down on my hands and knees picking up after the kids. So we were at the Y where we lived when the boys were taking like swim lessons, and that little one was about 1.5 years. And I'm trying to pick up the toys after them to clean up the room, just trying to be a good parent. Well, I get down on my hands and knees. What do I hear? Rip. And I said, oh, and a couple of unpleasant words. Basically, trying to tell myself to perform an anatomically impossible act. That's as far as I'm going. Oh, F me. So at that point, I had that taken care of. So I had a bucket handle tear, and then basically you'll see what they kind of look like. And now it's a lot different with stem cells and platelet-rich plasma. Tiger Woods had that. A number of golfers have that. Not just golfers, but athletes have that. So this is what it looks like. This is uniform. This is what you see. And now with fiber optics, you'll insert the sterile tip of the tube into the joint because it's a sterile procedure. Feed the other tube into wherever the camera apparatus is, and it'll be visible in the OR. And so they can be feeding that along and looking at it directly. And then what they'll do is they'll insert basically a grinder, a very fine drill bit, and basically just smooth that out. That's kind of how it's done. And then all the little fragments are sucked out because you're continuously flushing the air. That's kind of how it works. And I mean, this guy, mine was, I think I was back working in 5 days, 7 days, trying to treat patients with their leg out straight and that type of stuff. So that really summarizes. And if you got a chance to listen to the presentation I did from home on Friday, I covered a lot of the other joints. If you have any questions, as we look at the bones today in lab, we'll get a little bit more into that, as it were. So the difference between a sprain and a strain. A strain is nothing more than the force. They're not equivalent terms. A sprain is actual damage. And to be simplistic about it, typically you hear about grade 1, 2, and 3. Grade 1 means they're basically microscopic damage. It hurts. It gets better in a few days, maybe a week. Grade 2s indicate there's some type of tangible damage that you can either feel or see. And grade 3s are very, very severe, where there's really a large tear. So it's a matter of degree, typically with any joint that's affected by that. So whether they're stretched or torn, and the most common sites, ankle, knee, low back. And again, because they're ligaments, they take a while to heal. Today, if it's the grade 1 or even a grade 2, with a kind of rehabilitation, and there's a lot of devices that you can use on feet and ankles. There's something called an AFO, which I don't know if you've heard, it's called an ankle foot orthoses. and there can be a flexible hinge. What you're doing is you're holding the foot and holding behind, like halfway up the leg, and Velcro straps and things like that. And those have been around for a long time. There's a lot of ways to do that. I had how I got kind of into this business, as it were, into sort of the foot and ankle business, is my grandfather in 1931. They were dead broke, flat broke. He and my dad, who was 17 at the time, started a business because they were selling foot pads to what they call chiropodists, which were the precursors of the podiatrists. Try to make a few bucks. So they found a place where they could get felt at the end of run fragments, and a place where they could borrow, and someone would give them some credit on some steel dies. And my dad, who had arms like this, would pound them with a mallet and cut them out. Some of the foot doctors. That burgeoned into a business with adhesives and tape too, but they didn't really make the tape. But adhesive and padding materials that they used in paddings and strappings. And eventually, they supplied nearly every NFL team, as well as all sorts of major college teams. And maybe I told you, maybe I did. My uncle used to be on the sidelines with the 74, that vintage Steelers, and retired with the guy who was the head trainer. So he had a tremendous amount. He learned quickly. Wasn't very smart, but he was very good. He was what we call a parrot. He told him something, he'd repeat it back. It makes it seem like he knew something. Very interesting fellow. And long story short, a lot of the techniques I incorporated where there was a technique from Louisiana State called Louisiana ankle lock, which is a way of strapping to hold it. And they get these guys playing again, and gals playing again early on. Just remarkable. So I used to do a lot of that in my practice. I treated a lot of skaters because my kids all were skating. Yes, sir.
All these people who come back, are they still in pain? Like, maybe it's not healed, or they just like up and set up?
Yeah, well, in professional sports, they do it.
I was gonna say.
You see, in professional sports, they shoot them up with lidocaine,
Right.
and usually some type of steroid. It can be a two-edged sword. Steelers had a very unpleasant all-pro named Greg Wood. Okay. So back, and it was like in that 95 era of Super Bowl. And what they did is he twisted an ankle, and he said at halftime, they basically tore off the tape that was on it, injected it, and taped it up again. We got mercy. It really changed his career. So because of the, I mean, they're all sweated, they're a mess. Who knows what dirt is on there? Inject the guy, and now you've injected him and created, and whatever the conditions were, ended up with a MRSA infection. It's a very famous story about that. And it was never the same player. For a guy.
Did they let them heal the whole way, or is it just like it's technically healed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Even if it's not. It's like Jimmy G last night. I mean, did it surprise me at all this morning to hear Mike Florio who's from around here tell me that he was being evaluated for concussion, yet he played the whole game? Are you kidding me? Did you see the sandwich they made out of him in the second quarter? They made a Jimmy G sandwich. And my wife tells me he's a good-looking guy. Not that you wouldn't have noticed. And you saw his two brothers were there. That's a good-looking family. Even his 90-year-old grandfather was there. Hello. I apologize. It's all right. It's all right. Tell your roommate my wife's trying to send me pictures on my phone of cats and cat videos. It's still loading.
No, you have the capability side, okay?
She's got the pictures.
No, they're your cats. You can send them.
I know I'm terrible at taking pictures. She's good at the cats don't like me.
I'm just saying, I've been hearing about these pictures that you're going to show me for 3 years.
I'm sorry.
And you didn't.
She said, all those girls that love cats, they're still, I'll show it. It says still loading.
It's still loading for 2 weeks?
To send me over the weekend.
Oh.
I give up. All right, moving on. So luxation and subluxation. Dislocation is a luxation that's total, no longer in contact. Subluxation, it's a matter of degree. So a subluxation is something, if you go to a chiropractor, there's a lot of that. Subtle changes where they'll make adjustments to put them back in. So it's a matter of degree. To me, a dislocation is truly completely out of the joint. And again, the shoulder probably is as common as any of those. And I've seen so many of them. Partial dislocation is a little bit easier to deal with. And there's a lot of sport-related stuff. The great Jack Lambert had a true dislocation that ended his career here. And we were into the days when they had AstroTurf. There's a whole big argument now about grass and turf and where the injuries. And I listened to everybody. I mean, I listened to all over sports radio. The reality is that those surfaces have always been a problem. So at Three Rivers, which are these multi-play stadia, along with several others in Philadelphia and St. Louis and Cincinnati, he was making a tackle. His foot was planted, locked in there, and effectively he got pushed in such a way over the top that his big toe ended up like over here. Like it went from here to here. So that was a very famous turf toe. And this was a guy who was not going to have surgery. So they manipulated back in place. They treated it, relatively speaking, conservatively. Career was never the same. Hall of Fame player. Not pleasant. He used to play in all these hockey games. Like the Penguins would have this group with Mario's brother, who used to do some coaching of my kids, that type of stuff. And he checked hard, even for these charity games. Not pleasant. Not Mount Pleasant. Not pleasant. No, don't get excited about it. But Lambert wasn't one of these. We knew all the hockey guys and stuff like that. We were, because they used to, when my kids were, I was at hockey rinks at 4 a.m. for 7 years. One of these crazy parents who did that. I mean, so we knew all of these guys. I mean, those were just crazy. We all think they're going to be the next, Hall of Famer. Parents are nuts. Bursitis. Itis is, now this is the other part. I want to make sure I have enough time to at least get you most of it in. Itis is inflammation of. To me, arthritis is always a garbage term. It means inflamed joint. There's a whole lot of that going around. Bursitis specifically means an inflamed bursal sac. And it can be, most of the time it's traumatic. Sometimes it can be just repetitive trauma. And again, the golden rule for most of these: rest, ice, elevation, mild compression. You got to be careful using ace bandages. Elevation. If you can tolerate them, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, that's available. Understand that people who use those chronically, whether it's aspirin or ibuprofen or naproxen and ibuprofen, are very, very similar. Just have a different half-life. About 70% of people who use them long-term end up with some type of gastrointestinal problem. They clobber stomach lines. Tendinitis, another itis. You've got to be very careful with people using steroid injections into tendons. They weaken them and they will tear. So they don't, I have what I call the rule of Lou. If you were younger than I was, I started in practice when I was 28 years old, I didn't use steroids on you. I didn't inject them with steroids. That's the rule of Lou. You got to be older than me. So, which brings us to arthritis. Arthritis is not a universal term. There are two types of arthritis. Even though they both are highlighted by inflammation, there is inflammatory and non-inflammatory. The distinction is, what's the source of the arthritis? If it's your immune system as both the cause and really what makes it proliferate, that's an inflammatory arthritis. The most common of those, by no means common, is rheumatoid arthritis. This is not the most common arthritis. Non-inflammatory, even though it's red, it's hot, it's swollen, is basically what they call degenerative joint disease or osteoarthritis. So there's lots of different subgroups. By far and away, the most widespread crippling disease. Most of them, like I feel in the morning, pain, stiff, sometimes swelling. We have some that are caused by bacteria. That would be an example like where you basically do something that creates an opening that's there. So you have osteoarthritis, non-inflammatory, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory, and very famously, which is in the immunological spectrum, is gouty arthritis. That's called a crystal-induced arthritis. Okay. Gout is related to is a metabolic disorder where your body can't, for whatever reason, get rid of uric acid. Nitrogenous breakdown products. So when we get to the kidney, you're going to learn a lot about urea. Uric acid, UR gives it away, is from purine metabolism. So purines are adenine and guanine. We make them break cells all the time. So uric acid, we're allowed to have a certain amount in our bloodstream. Let's say 8 to 12 milligrams per cent on average. If you have an excessive amount, those crystals, just like putting too much salt in water, will settle at the bottom. In this case, they'll settle in the hips. Most common in the foot, ankle, sometimes the elbow, but not exclusively there. Unlike salt crystals, which are microscopically nice little squares, uric acid crystals are like little daggers. Because every salt crystallizes differently. Those daggers jab into joints. White blood cells try to gobble them up. White blood cells explode. It's extraordinarily painful. Much more common in men 35 to 50. Then women start to bring that number back to equal around age 55 to 65. I can't even tell you how many cases I've treated. Sir?
Why can't you just drink more water?
You could drink more water, but sometimes it's metabolically oriented. We think it has to do with an enzyme pathway that's been interrupted, typically with something involving xanthine oxidase. So the old days, it used to be a disease of rich people because they associated with organ meats, things that were purine rich. And poor people couldn't afford those kinds of things, liver, stuff like that, whatever your feeling is about offal. Offal, the fifth quarter. They like organ meats. Where I grew up, we lived on chopped liver. So you would call it pate, we'd call it chopped liver. Okay? But that's why. So it's maybe 5 to 10% are dietary, maybe 5 to 10% are kidney related. The rest of them are probably metabolic. So even pushing the fluids it'll help, but it's not going to be. It's very easy to treat with medicine.
It's like you just produce too much.
Pardon me?
You just produce like too much.
Right, it doesn't break it down. It doesn't break it down so it can be excreted rapidly enough. So things are either too much production or not enough excretion. And so this enzyme interferes with the breakdown pathway. So you can be excreted in a more reliable form. And it can be life-threatening because it's not just joints, it can eventually affect the heart. That's why people died of gout. It'll cause what they're called tophaceous deposits. It's a very interesting disease. So moving on, arthritis, sometimes called is wear and tear. If you're in sport and you've twisted an ankle or you had a really bad sprain, down the road, that all adds up. Most of the time, if there was bleeding into the joint, you're going to get post-traumatic arthritis. It might take 20 or 30 years. Okay. If you statistically, age 85, half of us have it to some extent. I've had it in my back for much longer, much earlier than since I'm only 72. So it's irreversible. Okay. A lot of theories. Enzymes, cartilage broken down, those little bone spurs we call osteophytes or joint mice, those ones that get stuck. And the treatment is pretty much universal. Heat, rest, exercise, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. If you can tolerate them, most people can't. Okay. And in very, very severe cases, we'll do implant arthroplasty. You'll replace the joint. That is there. So is it usually part of the aging process? We hear sounds sometimes. When you see deformity and you hear sounds, it's a little different than a young, healthy person making sounds when they're walking or doing some activity. There's lots of things you can use. They say they're not effective. To me, they were effective. Glucosamine and chondroitin sulfate. I had a lot of success with those, still do. So I'm more in the category of it work. I was always a whatever works kind of person. Or if it's the old saying is, if it ain't broke, don't go fixing it. So those are things that are easily available. And if it didn't help you, it's the chicken soup theory. It's like your mom. Louis, you don't feel good, have chicken soup. Would that help? Wouldn't hurt. My mother. Louis, you're gaining weight. Would you like something to eat? It's Jewish mother syndrome. Every mother's like that. Ruth, still thinking about you. Capsaicin creams. Love these. Okay, you can buy these over the counter. They used to be prescription. They're made from the extract of red peppers, which are capsicums. And so that Scoville index, whether it's jalapenos or habaneros or the famous ghost peppers, all of them have different degrees of capsaicin. In about a third of the people, it helps. A third of the people, it doesn't do anything. And a third of people can't tolerate it because their skin just goes, oh my God. I was using that stuff on patients 30 years ago, 40 years ago. These are different. I have an arthritis like this. I have a variation of what's called psoriatic arthritis. These are autoimmune in origin. Some function of your immune system is attacking otherwise healthy structures. There's a lot of things that can be done. It can be a response to infection. It could be some type of misprogramming. It can be hereditary nature. It shows at different times, but for some reason it does this. Typically, I take issue with this, and this, you should all listen to this. The most common people are affected, and in my practice, 4 out of 5 female. Okay, 2nd through 5th decades. So 15 to 55, much more common. So it's a really troubling because it can be very severe. And so the distinction, and I don't have enough time to do all this, so I have to do a little bit of it in the lab. The distinction is that normally osteoarthritis, the joint gets thicker, wider, and narrows to start. Here, the highlight film is swelling because it's an immunological inflammatory condition. So it's very, very severe. So we start with joint pain, swelling, and where osteoarthritis is usually unilateral, large joints, knees, shoulders, hips, one side, not a pattern. These kind of immunological arthritises are bilateral and symmetrical, and generally hands and wrists, fingers and toes, small joints to start. So swelling, usually bilateral, anemia because it's immunological in nature. And so you have, relatively speaking, an overabundance of one cell type disfavoring the other. So it causes blood alterations. Osteoporosis, the swelling tends to remove the calcific material to a certain extent. Weakness, sometimes cardiovascular problems. And I'd rather than give it short shift, I'll stop it here and I'll just finish this up before we start the bones and lab. How's that? Thank you. All right, we're good. See if I can conjure up some